Before we start the video, no one needs to tell me vampires are not real. They're obviously not real. But they were convenient figures for people to use to criticize what they considered monstrous in real life, or conversely, to fantasize about what they considered ideal in real life. Precisely because they are fictional, monsters make one hell of a good literary stand-in for anything that writers and readers most fear or desire. And in the case of the vampire, it has been used as just such a stand-in for over 200 years. While there are countless books and articles dissecting the true meaning hiding behind the allegorical figure of numerous vampires, from Count Dracula to Edward Cullen, I'll just talk about my own interpretations and leave the rest for your own discovery in the recommended reading section. Of all the different approaches I could make on this subject, I'm most interested in looking at it from the perspective of class conflict and socioeconomic struggle. So without further ado, here are 5 vampire myths that are true, according to novelists, and a pretentious literature student. The link between vampires and elite members of society was established as early as 1819, when John Polidori published the world's first vampire novel, The Vampyre. Inspired by his fraught relationship with the real-life aristocrat and literary celebrity Lord Byron, Polidori's Lord Ruthven closely mirrors the characteristics of 19th century aristocrats, titled, incredibly wealthy, well-educated, physically attractive, and morally offensive. In the book, Ruthven uses his riches and charms to prey on humans with free rein, and the humans in the novel are completely helpless to his evil machinations. The list of his offenses are long and that of his punishments blank. He ruins the reputation of many a lady by being promiscuous, he purposely loans money to penniless gamblers and ruins them by winning everything back, he kills the protagonist's love interest, and he kills the protagonist's sister, both by drinking their blood. Polidori's portrayal of the vampire as an unbridled force of moral and financial ruin reflects public opinion regarding the aristocracy in pre-Victorian England. In the early 1800s, wealth and political power were exclusively concentrated within the aristocracy, especially on the eldest sons, who inherited everything from their fathers by law. Contemporary journalist John Wade argued against this system, criticizing that the aristocracy have the means of extorting for their junior branches of their families a forced subsistence from the public, which has no option whether they will support them or not. The aristocrats' livelihood is violent because it exploits both the productivity and the powerlessness of those beneath them, while they themselves remain unproductive. Wade depicts a parasitic relationship that is most aptly captured in William Cobbett's nickname for the aristocrat, the tax eater. The word conjures up a visceral image of violent and parasitic sustenance that perfectly corresponds to Ruthven's blood-sucking in The Vampire. But as deplorable as they were, there were simply not enough policies to restrain their power. Although part of the members of Parliament had been chosen by public election since the 14th century, the more important offices continued to be held almost exclusively by members of the upper house, that is, members appointed by birth instead of election. This system allowed the aristocracy to remain the leaders of the people in both central and local government. You can see from Wade's criticism that they truly dominated every aspect of English life. We have an aristocratic church, aristocratic bar, aristocratic taxation, aristocratic corn laws, aristocratic laws of property, and until recently, aristocratic game laws. In short, the aristocratic spirit pervades everything. All is privilege, prescription, monopoly, association, and corporation. In short, the British aristocracy was rolling in the lap of luxury. Luxury made possible by the sweat of everyone else who had to work, not only for their own living but for their superiors' living as well. No wonder Polidori's vampire was an unstoppable force of evil. With the advent of the Victorian era, however, the boundaries between vampires and humans grew thin. Human characters are turned into vampires, while the so-called sympathetic vampire is given human traits like emotions and physical weaknesses. The thinning boundary between vampire and human corresponds to the thinning barrier between the aristocracy and the middle classes, the upper division of which grew to be far wealthier in their factories than those who relied on inheritances from their father's farmlands. In addition, an increasing number of middle-class men were enfranchised through multiple reform bills. With political reform, the rise of industrial capitalism, and the attendant rise of meritocracy and self-made men, the aristocracy was slowly brought down from its ivory tower, and so was the vampire. Victorian vampires were no longer so invincible, nor their prey so defenseless. Sir Varney from Varney the Vampire or The Feast of Blood is an early signal of such changes. Similar in dress and title to Lord Ruthven, yet much poorer, weaker, and apparently more moral, Sir Varney is the first of his kind to submit himself to the will of humans. The plot demonstrates human characters' agency in negotiating and even controlling their relationship with the vampire, reflecting the strengthened agency of the rising middle classes in the mid-1800s. As an immortal aristocrat fallen on hard times, Sir Varney tries to kick out another aristocratic family called the Bannerworths from their home and take the house and its wealth for himself. But someone tells him that he's better than that. That someone is Charles Holland, the son of an admiral and an artist by trade. After Varney spares the life of Holland's fiancée, Flora Bannerworth, Holland thinks that there is hope for Varney after all, and tries to awaken that better nature which is slumbering within him. He persuades Varney that there are such shadows of good only sleeping, which require only a touch to awaken them to life and energy. At this earnest plea, Sir Varney is moved to confess his past of gambling addiction and highway robbery, after which he feels free of his obsession over avarice and revenge, and promises to never harm Flora Bannerworth or her family again. In the end, Sir Varney honors his promise, abandons his schemes to rob the Bannerworths, and leaves them alone. Basically, Holland succeeds in what the protagonist of The Vampire couldn't. He protects his lover from the vampire and banishes him from their lives. Not only that, but he and his uncle, the Admiral, are left in charge of Bannerworth Hall as a token of the Bannerworths' thanks to them for keeping them safe from Sir Varney. The self-made man from the Navy and his nephew become the new owners of a nobleman's hall after purging it of its old aristocratic ghosts. This reflects the changing social-political landscape of early Victorian Britain. One such change was the 1832 Reform Act, which broadened the franchise to include male property owners such as small landowners, tenant farmers, shopkeepers, all householders who paid a yearly rental of £10 or more, and some lodgers. The growth of the factory system in the wake of industrialization also diversified sources of wealth, which the middle class accessed through trade and business ownership to gain social mobility. Consequently, the influence of middle-class men in politics grew to the point where there emerged several influential politicians of middle-class origins, the first of whom was Richard Cobden, the son of a yeoman farmer who became the owner of a calico printing factory before entering office in 1841. Yet at the same time, the middle class was far from overpowering the aristocrats, either in fiction or in reality. Holland does not vanquish Varney in a violent conflict, but merely persuades him to behave. The Admiral does not win Bannerworth Hall in a feud with the aristocratic family, but merely receives it from their hands as a reward for his assistance. If you think about the decidedly less successful conflict between the working class and the enfranchised during the Chartist movement, Turberville was right to conclude that aristocratic influence continued to be strong right on into the middle of the century. Disillusionment also colors Richard Cobden's account of his own experiences as MP. The higher classes never stood so high in relative social and political rank as at present. The middle class has been content with the very crumbs from their table. By the time of his death in 1865, Cobden did not see himself as a man who had either engineered or witnessed the middle-class takeover of English political or social life. Such an inversion would not occur until the latter half of the 19th century and the publication of Dracula. In Dracula, a bunch of professional middle-class people assemble a team called the Crew of Light to slay the evil vampire Count Dracula. Except for one nobleman, its members are made up of 2 doctors, a solicitor, a school teacher, and an American ranch owner. Compared with Dracula's decaying castle filled with ancient coins that are out of currency and Lucy's luxurious unemployment and, quote, going a good deal to picture galleries and for walks and rides in the park, the people who hunt them are mostly professionals of specialized knowledge, industry, and resourcefulness. In fact, their very identity as middle-class professionals is essential to Dracula's defeat. Jonathan Harker's job as a real estate solicitor leads him to Dracula's castle and to uncover his true identity. Dr. Seward's job as a psychiatrist allows them to better understand vampiric behavior. Dr. Van Helsing's vast knowledge of vampire lore enables him to spearhead the hunt for the vampire. The two doctors are especially elevated to a position of authority when compared to the doctors from earlier novels, such as the completely oblivious Dr. Chillingworth from Varney the Vampire or the knowledgeable yet passive Dr. Gratz from Carmilla. Under their attack, elite vampires like Count Dracula and the idle upper-class Lucy become increasingly mortal as they become subject to physical violence, such as beheading, staking, burning, and finally, death. In Dracula, the death of the ruling aristocrat is as final as it was a reality by the end of the century. By the time Stoker's novel came out in 1897, middle-class values were all the rage in Britain, as they had been well-defined and widely popularized by Samuel Smiles decades earlier with his book Self-Help. Smile advises that through perseverance, industry, and self-culture, a person of the humblest rank may elevate himself to the employer of labor and a thriving man, that is, the classic self-made bourgeois. The constitution of the aristocracy, on the other hand, may be less admirable and more prone to idleness, as riches are so great a temptation to ease and self-indulgence, and an easy and luxurious existence does not train men to effort or encounter with difficulty. By illustrating several examples of privileged yet industrious members of parliament and noblemen, Smiles urges that it is only right for the aristocrat as well as the laborer to apply themselves. The popularity of such exemplars made it clear that by the late 19th century, parasitism was no longer tolerated by public sentiment. Nor was it so by law. This much became clear in 1870 when the government introduced competitive entrance examinations for the civil service. Alain de Botton assesses the examinations as the landmark meritocratic measure of Britain, as up until then the bureaucracy was filled with people whose only claim to any position was their identity as or biological relation to aristocrats. For the first time, ruling positions were rewarded through open competition based on merit rather than patronage. Not only were industrial businesses open to new talent, but the very doors of government were open for men of all backgrounds to prove themselves. This was true for Parliament as well, which saw an increasing extension of the franchise. The 1867 Reform Act roughly doubled the electorate in England and Wales, and this was followed by the 1884 Reform Act, which extended the vote to roughly 60% of all British men. The demographic of MPs also became more inclusive as the sons of shopkeepers and business owners such as John Bright, William Henry Smith, and Joseph Chamberlain rose to prominence as politicians. As the majority of the electorate were self-made or modest property owners, and an increasing number of candidates were of non-aristocratic origins, the middle class grew to be an establishment of size and influence more significant than ever. David Cannadine concludes that the ensuing breakdown of the privileged status of the British aristocracy between 1890 and 1920 was one of the most profound economic and psychological changes of the period, one that clearly left its mark on the cultural products of its times. Interview with the Vampire sets a new pattern for relationships between human and vampires, one colored with more desire than fear. As the vampire migrated to the US in the 20th century, they began to lose their roots in European aristocracy and assimilate into a more democratic society. Although the vampires of American fiction retain their wealth and rank, the way their assets are earned, spent, and perceived by others undergoes a dramatic shift. At first glance, Babette, Claudia, Madeline, and the anonymous musician seem like four entirely different characters. However, their stories are strikingly similar, almost identical. As soon as they make the acquaintance of the vampires, Louis and Lestat, they immediately gain social mobility. When Babette's brother dies, she and her sisters fall in danger of living on a small pension with no male provider. Sympathetic and in love, Louis uses his vampiric detachment from human society to gain the insight and wisdom he needs to guide her. By following his advice, Babette earns a comfortable living for herself while leaving her sisters with an immense dowry. When Claudia's mother dies, Lestat turns her into a vampire and takes her in as his own child. Having saved her from the squalor of an orphanage, Louis and Lestat spoil her with all kinds of dresses, jewels, toys, and dolls. Lestat also becomes the patron of an unnamed musician, whose music wouldn't have sold at all if not for his friendship with Lestat, who lavishes him with money and fine dining in exchange for his art. In the case of Madeline the doll maker, she becomes better at her job after gaining a vampire's skill and a vampire's intensity, with which she accomplishes feats such as making, in the space of one night, out of a few sticks of wood, a perfect rocking chair. Had she chosen to make her own living, her craftsmanship would have made her a name and a fortune. In each of their relationships with Louis and Lestat, the human characters gain a level of social mobility that wouldn't have been possible without the vampire's incredible material and intellectual resources. The book further highlights the capitalist aspect of vampiric agency by closely following the vampire's line of income, a sharp departure from the mysterious, unnamed resources of Lord Ruthven or the vaguely ancient gold of Count Dracula. Louis runs a plantation and makes investments that accumulate into enormous wealth throughout the decades. Parisian vampires run a theater where they make a show out of their superhuman grace, speed, and gore. Even Lestat, who is painfully ignorant of financial matters, uses his vampire keenness to pickpocket, gamble, and so acquire cash at any moment. The vampire is no longer a noble living off of the land and title of their family, free of labor, but a worker who takes advantage of their supernatural traits to earn their keep. The vampire, as a capable breadwinner and generous consumer, becomes more an object of desire than fear, an obtainable desire at that. We can see that from how Madeline gets her way with Louis when she actually asks him to turn her into a vampire. In the years that followed the end of World War II, the average income of American households rose to a point where, upon seeing a full-scale replica of the home of the average member of America's working class at the American National Exhibition of 1959, an incensed Soviet press angrily denied that an ordinary American worker could conceivably live in such luxury. But they could. At the turn of the century, large department stores opened across Europe and America, including Macy's in New York and Marshall Field's in Chicago in 1902. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony at Marshall Field's, the manager, Gordon Selfridge, declared that they had built this great institution for ordinary people, so that it can be their store, their downtown home, their buying headquarters, and not just that of the swagger rich. Just as anyone could earn, anyone could spend, and consumerism was sold to the public as a way to enjoy the same privileges as the upper class, even to become upper class. And why not? According to the American dream, anyone could become elite, and Lestat himself echoes this sentiment in the book. He didn't consider the world's small population of vampires as being a select club, a thought he follows through by making both the richest and the poorest, from plantation owner to orphan girl, as his immortal companions. The resulting elevation of their lifestyle is signaled by their lavish purchases, from clothing to jewelry to housing, marking the consumerist method through which modern vampires spend their earnings to buy their status, just as people do in real life in a capitalist society. However, as a #1 New York Times bestseller and multi-billion film franchise, it was the Twilight series that came to preoccupy the world with the materialistic fantasy of sports cars, black cars, Ivy League schools, and private islands. The immense popularity and cultural domination of this fantasy is symptomatic of the things that its audience most craved in the new millennium. One such craving, left unsatisfied for many by the increasingly transparent failings of neoliberalism, was financial security. Wendy Brown characterizes the zeitgeist of neoliberal society as the economic and psychological insecurity felt by increasing individuals. Deregulation eliminates a range of public goods and social security provisions and dismantles classic 20th century solidarities among workers, consumers, and electorates. The combined effect is to generate intensely isolated and unprotected individuals, wholly vulnerable to capital's vicissitudes. Examples of such vicissitudes abounded at the time of Twilight's conception and publication. There was the dot-com crash in 2000 and the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, which displaced many from their jobs and homes. With the post-war glow of prosperity and optimism long gone and several recessions under its belt, Y2K America had economic security high on its list of priorities, and the threat of financial instability loomed low on the horizon. The same vampiric traits that were treated with suspicion in past writings are now explicitly made into resources on which the vampire capitalizes to gain social mobility within specific contexts, such as staying competitive in an increasingly competitive job market or becoming a homeowner. One such trait is the vampire's intelligence. If Count Dracula's perfect English and knowledgeability about English culture held the sinister threat of foreign invasion, the Cullens' perfect recall allows them to excel in academia and enroll in Ivy League schools like Cornell, Harvard, and Dartmouth. And we can't forget about their superpowers. Most conveniently, Alice's ability to see the future allows them to accumulate wealth through her uncanny ability to predict trends in the stock market. Also, unlike the human body, which weakens over time, the vampiric body's tirelessness and immortality make vampires the perfect laborer in the sense that they are literally always ready to work. Without any need for sleep or rest, they can and, if allowed, will work non-stop, as Carlyle proves in his account of the Spanish influenza. That was a hard time to pretend to be human. There was so much work to be done, and I had no need of rest. How I hated to go back to my house, to hide in the dark and pretend to sleep while so many were dying. In fact, Edward reveals the secret behind his seemingly infinite talents to be the infinite amount of time available to him to perfect them. Emmett would have you believe that I'm such a know-it-all because of the mind reading, but the truth is that I've just had a lot of free time. Put together, every part of a vampire is geared towards making them an apex predator in the urban jungle. The socio-economic weaponization of vampiric traits is symptomatic of how neoliberalism functions beyond the boundaries of an economic policy to shape people's everyday mindset as an ideology. As it specifies entrepreneurial conduct everywhere, it constrains the subject to act in a capital-enhancing fashion everywhere. In such a society, vampires are not the apex predator because they suck on the blood of humans, but because they are the perfect entrepreneur. And in such a world like that, the capital-enhancing act for a human would be to turn into a vampire herself, just as Bella does. In this context, Edward's sparkling, diamond-like skin can be read as the reconfiguration of the vampiric body into the perfect capital, inexhaustible labor, and thus inexhaustible wealth. Bella's always talking about how perfect Edward and his family are, but in the end, the vampires from Twilight are perfect purely from the perspective of capitalism and neoliberalism. Bella's desire to become one of them at the cost of her own humanity, and the yearning of fans all over the world to follow in her footsteps, even in just their imagination, are symptomatic of our desperation to conform to what society asks of us, and in return to attain economic stability and abundance. Unfortunately, it is a state that seems unattainable for many to the point where they feel like they have to be inhuman, superhuman, in order to attain it. This message betrays the fear of an unattainable standard of living, one that cannot be managed unless the imperfect human body is made inhumanly perfect. The vampirism that is presented as an aspiration in Twilight is, in truth, a neoliberal dystopia written and marketed as a utopia. So as you can see, vampires over the ages have morphed to become many things, from evil noblemen to petty thieves to billionaire doctors. It's fascinating to see how literature enables society to critique, contain, and cope with its anxieties in such imaginative ways, either consciously or subconsciously. I'm sure there are many more vampires out there from other parts of the world written in other languages. I wonder what those monsters have to say about the society that wrote them.